Madre Marta was firm in declaring that Don Pedro could not go to the Christmas Eve service with Lola. "But Don Pedro is so good," begged Lola. "He works all the time. I would just tie him up outside the church door. I know he would be quiet." "All right," sighed Lola's mother, finally agreeing. "Take him along if you wish." Lola's face was radiant as she ran out from the small square adobe dwelling in the New Mexican village where they lived and hurried to her pet. "My good little burro," she exclaimed, throwing her arms round the donkey's neck. "I just couldn't go to church without you." Lola was lucky that she could express her love to Don Pedro in words, while he could only twitch his ears to show affection. The weather had been very warm, and on this particular day before Christmas it was unusually hot. "If the heat spell goes on," Lola's father said, "too much snow will melt in the hills and the river could overflow." As darkness came, the family prepared to go to the church, and Lola went to get Don Pedro, but the little donkey was not in his shed. "Don Pedro has wandered off," Lola called to her mother. "I will find him and meet you at the church." She took a lantern and began her search. It wasn't far from the adobe house to the church, just down the road, over the river's bridge and up to the small steeple chapel. As Lola searched for Don Pedro, she saw the people of the valley walking or driving their cars to the midnight service. After looking everywhere for Don Pedro without success, Lola started walking towards the church. As she crossed the old bridge, she felt it sway more than usual. The water in the river was very high. How black it was, how swift. Suddenly Lola's heart began to pound. Something was moving near the river's edge. "Who's there?" she called out. In response came the loud ruckus braying of a donkey. "Don Pedro!" Lola gasped, and sliding down the bank to the water's edge, she found her little burro. There he was, stuck in the mud and water by the bridge. Lola set down her lantern, and quickly wading out into the rising river, she stretched out her arms and seized her pet's tail in both hands. "Kick, Don Pedro," she commanded. "Kick as hard as you can." Don Pedro obeyed as Lola tugged with all her might, and at last the little burro kicked himself free of the mud and came charging out of the water. As Lola picked up the lantern, its light disclosed something that made her gasp. "Don Pedro," she cried, flinging herself upon the little donkey's back. "Go quickly. Go as fast as you can." Inside the old church, good Padre Carlos had just finished telling of the joys and blessings of Christmas. Suddenly the door of the church swung wide, and up the aisle came, of all things, a little burro, soggy and wet and covered with mud. "What sacrilege is this?" cried the padre. "Such a disturbance in a church." Then he saw the small girl, almost as wet and muddy as the donkey. "Oh, Padre," Lola cried, "I'm so glad we got here in time. The bridge is all washed out at the bottom. If anyone drives over it in a car, it will fall. People will be killed." The whole congregation rose to its feet in alarm as Lola blurted out her story. When she finished, Padre Carlos touched the little donkey with tender hands. "God works in mysterious ways," he said. "Let us give thanks that perhaps lives have been saved through Lola and this little burro." Lola glanced at Don Pedro quietly standing beside her. As she lovingly scratched the fuzzy head, she remembered another little donkey who had stood by the baby Jesus in a stable 2,000 years earlier. Yes, she thought, Don Pedro has a right to be here in church on this Christmas Eve.